Chapter 7. War Machines. Sera stared out the window at where Dak cowered in the shadow of a massive Viking. Her heart pounded heavily in her chest, and her voice had an edge of panic. "We need to go out after him." She'd already started for the tower stairs when Rick put his hand on her shoulder. "We have a job to do, Sera," he said. "If we go out there and get captured, how are we going to fix the break?" "He needs our help," she snapped at him. But Rick still didn't let her go. Sera closed her eyes, trying to find patience, but there was nothing left. She didn't understand how he could be hesitating. It was Dak out there beyond the fortress walls, and he clearly needed their help. "I think there's a bigger problem you two are forgetting," Bill suggested. Sera glared at him. "I know what we're supposed to be doing," she snapped. "But sometimes saving your best friend is more important than saving the world." "What about saving yourself?" he asked. Sera frowned, not understanding. Bill pointed out the window. "I'd say we have about 5, maybe 10 minutes before the Vikings attack us with everything they've got, and what they've got is a whole lot more force than we have." She didn't want to, but Sera peeked out the window facing the mainland. What she saw made her head spin. In the few moments she'd spent arguing, the Vikings had rolled massive wooden contraptions into view. She had no idea what they were, but she had a sinking suspicion that she'd find out soon enough. Bill joined her by the window. "Ballisti," he said. "War machines they're used to fling huge stones. And that's just their opening move." "We have to do something," she whispered. Rick and Bill exchanged glances. "There's only one thing we really can do," Bill offered. Sera sighed, already fearing the answer. "And what's that?" Rick held out a bow and a quiver of arrows, as if she'd have any idea how to use them. "We have to fight." In the distance, Sera heard the first Viking war horn begin to blow. It was followed by another and another, until the air was swollen with the sound of them. "But what if we fail? What if the Vikings take Paris after all?" Once again, Bill glanced at Rick, and Sera was pretty sure there was some sort of silent communication between them that she wasn't a part of. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," he finally said, as the first of the Viking catapults let loose with a barrage of stones and arrows. Rollo had shoved Dak into a tent, set Vigi at the entrance to guard him, and then traipsed off to the battlefield. Dak protested as much as he could. Not only did he absolutely have to get back to Sera, but he also wasn't keen on the idea of completely missing the battle. That just wasn't fair. At first, Dak tried to sneak past Vigi, but even when she seemed in the deepest sleep, as indicated by ear-shattering snores, the moment Dak reached for the tent flap, she'd leap to her feet and growl so loud he felt the air hum. In the end, he came up with a foolproof plan. Vigi was just like every other dog he'd ever known. Give her a solid 10 minutes of scratching behind the ears, and she'd pledge her life to you. In fact, his plan to win her over worked too well. She tried to follow him out onto the battlefield several times, until he finally had to find a length of rope and tie her to a support pole in the tent. "Sorry, girl," he said, giving her a good rub under the chin when she looked up at him mournfully. "I don't want you getting hurt," he added. Her expression seemed to ask, "What about you?" Which was a question Dak didn't want to think about. He found a pair of pants and a slightly flared wool tunic, and had exchanged his Frankish clothes so that he'd blend in easier with the Viking horde. It seemed to work, because as he walked through the camp, no one paid him any mind. From there, it was just a matter of following the sounds of battle. Dak figured he had read more about war than anyone he knew. He'd memorized casualty lists and studied timelines of weapons development and learned battle strategy, and until this moment, he'd have called himself an expert. But real war was nothing like the accounts he'd read in books. First, there was the noise. It was so much louder than he'd ever expected. Men shouted commands, trebuchets launched piles of stones, and ballistae shot javelins into the air. Horns blared and church bells rang. Then there were the smells, smoke from fires set against the walls around the city, blood from open wounds, the earthy stench of mud and sweat. His fingers itched for his square diary to record it all with. In his mind, he imagined returning home, sharing his first-hand account, and becoming a famous historian. He'd be a world-renowned expert, and when he opened his mouth to share random bits of history, people would listen without laughing or rolling their eyes. Just as his daydream culminated with him walking across the stage to receive the Nobel Prize, he was interrupted by harsh reality.
"You, boy!"
someone shouted angrily. Dak glanced over his shoulder, attempting to look innocent. He recognized the Viking who was approaching him. It was one of the men who'd accompanied Siegfried into the chapel the previous morning, the one named Gorm, with the bright red scar slashing from eyebrow to chin, who had seemed suspicious of Rick's ability to speak both Old Norse and French.
"Don't you think you're a little out of time?"
he asked Dak now. The question sounded harmless enough, but Dak grasped its double meaning. Gorm knew Dak wasn't supposed to be there, that he was from another century, which meant that Dak was in big trouble if Gorm got his hands on him. So Dak ran, right into the heart of the battlefield. Chapter 8. Under Attack. Sera watched the first bombardment of stones in wonder. So many projectiles filled the air that it was almost impossible to see the sky. It wasn't until Bill shoved her away from the tower's window and crouched over her that she truly understood what was about to happen. Or rather, what had just begun. The tower shuddered under the onslaught. Stones splintered walls, arrows zinged through the open window, embedding in the wooden floor by her feet. "We have to find someplace safe!" Rick shouted, and they crawled toward the stairs. A sea of Franks pushed against them, racing toward the top of the tower to take up defensive positions. The men wore battle dress, thickly padded tunics, and metal helmets. Some carried swords and shields, and others had bows and arrows. Just looking at them made Sera feel more vulnerable in her simple woolen tunic. "This way," Bill urged, taking her elbow and pulling her into a narrow, dark corridor. She'd only taken a few steps when she heard Rick grunt behind her. She turned to find him being pulled in the opposite direction by a large Frankish soldier. "Only 200 men on each side of the river to defend the tower," the soldier said, shoving a wicked-looking sword into Rick's hands, his wrist bent awkwardly under the weight of it. "We need all the manpower we can get." He began dragging Rick up the stairs. "Wait!" Sera called out. She swallowed and tried to keep her voice from shaking. "I'll help too," she offered. She'd already been separated from Dak. She couldn't lose Rick as well. Behind her, Bill hissed for her to be quiet. The soldier squinted at her, as if seriously considering her offer, and then scoffed. "You should be back across the river with the other children. What you're still doing here, I don't know, but you're well entrapped now." He nudged Rick toward the staircase, where he was swallowed up by the rush of men. "You want to help?" the man asked. "Stay out of our way!" And then he, too, was gone. Sera tried to run after them, but Bill kept his hand tight around her arm. "He's right, Sera," he said, but she didn't want to hear it. She felt like she was losing complete control over everything. Dak's role was to use his historical knowledge to figure out the breaks and how to fix them. Rick's job was to make sure they could always communicate with those around them. That left Sera, whose only contribution was to make sure the infinity ring warped them to the right place in time. And even that wasn't so complicated that Dak or Rick couldn't figure it out if they needed to. Which meant that Sera's real responsibility was keeping the three of them together. They'd been in 885 for less than 24 hours, and she'd already failed. Miserably. As if sensing how upset Sera was, Bill gently squeezed her arm. "He'll be okay," he said. "They both will." Sera shook her head. "How can you know?" Everything about history is already changed, thanks to us, and we don't know if it's for the better or worse." He took her hand in his, which felt a little awkward at first until they sorted their fingers out. "From my point of view, I can definitely say it's changed for the better," he said softly, causing Sera to blush. She really wasn't sure how to respond to that. Ever since they'd left home, she'd been so focused on fixing the breaks that it never occurred to her to think about how their meddling with history affected those they met along the way. She thought about the first historian they'd met, Gloria, the butcher, and how her eyes had grown wide when they told her about airplanes and men on the moon. Did she then spend the rest of her life dreaming about such things? Or did she go about her ordinary duties as if she'd never met 3 kids from the future? Just then, there was a tremendous crashing sound. A few stones fell from the ceiling and shattered at her feet. A long crack snaked up the wall, letting in a slice of sunlight and the sound of men shouting and swords clashing. Another jolt jarred the tower, and Sera and Bill stumbled as they tried to catch their footing. "It isn't safe here," Bill shouted at her over the din of battle. "Follow me!" And then he was leading her through the dim corridor, his hand still holding hers tightly. They passed a few narrow slits in the walls that Bill explained were arrow loops, meant to allow men inside to fire arrows on anyone attacking. As they passed by each one, Sera snuck glances outside, trying to catch glimpses of the battle. Hundreds of ships lined the river, each one stuffed with men wearing chainmail and helmets, waving swords or shooting at the tower with bows and arrows. All of them moved toward the bridge, disgorging their cargo of soldiers on the nearby shore. Here, they joined others digging at the foundation of the tower with pickaxes and shovels, trying to tunnel under the thick wall. Along the northern bank, more Vikings prepped trebuchets and catapults, lobbing stones and flaming pots of oil over the walls of the fortified city. The sky was thick with projectiles, the air dingy with smoke and loud with shouting and screaming. Church bells rang and Viking horns blew as if the two sides could war with sound alone. Bill drew her through a tight passage into a tiny circular room with a high-domed ceiling. "It's an old turret," he said. "They changed the design of the tower after this room was built, and most people forget about it. We should be safe here for a while, at least until the bridge clears enough for us to sneak back to the city." Narrow gaps were spread along the wall at knee height, and Sera pressed her face against one. "Murder holes," Bill explained. He pointed out how the sides of the holes flared out at steep angles, narrowing the view. "Men can kneel here and shoot crossbows, picking off soldiers outside, but it's almost impossible to get an arrow back in." He leaned against one of the walls and slid until he was sitting. His legs took up a good portion of the floor space, so that Sera had to sit with her knees tucked against her chest. She could still feel the floor trembling beneath her as stones struck the tower. Even though it meant watching the ravaging forces attacking them, she couldn't help but look outside, trying to catch a glimpse of Dak. She hoped he was smart enough to keep far, far away from the battlefront, but she also knew him well enough to be pretty sure he'd never stay away from the center of action. "Please don't be stupid," she murmured to herself. As if on cue, her eye caught on a small figure darting through the throng of Vikings. Sera had been in enough PE classes with Dak to recognize his awkward gait as he ducked behind a pile of discarded, bloody shields. "Dak!" she cried out, banging her hand against the wall. But all she could do was watch and hope none of the flying debris from either side would hit her friend. This wasn't like dodgeball, a game that Dak never excelled at. These flying balls could kill. A single shield detached itself from the pile and started moving haltingly across the battlefield. The wooden circle was huge, at least as tall as Dak, and he teetered under the weight of it. A band of Vikings streamed around him, racing toward the tower with blood-curdling shouts and roars, but one of them must have knocked into Dak because he tripped and went sprawling. Just as he started to push himself up, a massive bolt shot from the tower and tore through the air. It barely grazed Dak's head before skewering 7 Vikings who'd been running along behind him. From somewhere above, she heard men cheering as one of them shouted, "To the kitchens! We have a human kebab for them to cook!" Sera cried out as the men staggered and then fell. Dak's face went white with shock, and he crouched, seemingly frozen, completely out in the open where anyone could take aim at him. She heard someone screaming and realized belatedly that it was her, calling Dak's name and telling him to move. Chapter 9. Bearing the Standard. Dak couldn't move. The bolt had come so close to his head, he could swear it had created a new part in his hair. He heard the sickening sound of the sharp metal tip striking the Vikings who'd been running behind him, and then the grunt as they collapsed. Dark red blood seeped from their chests, turning the ground around them to a scarlet mud. The reality of where he was and what he was doing struck him like a battering ram against a fortress gate. He was unarmed and unarmored in the middle of a chaotic battlefield. On the positive side, he'd put some distance between himself and Gorm, but getting killed now wouldn't be helping anyone, least of all himself. For the briefest moment, the violence around him paused, and he thought he heard someone scream his name. He stared up at the tower only 100 yards away, trying to seek out a familiar face. It was useless, and he knew it. Rick and Sera would be safe inside the island fortress by now, far, far away from the danger of battle. But then he thought he heard the same voice shout for him to move. He didn't even question where the command came from. Instead, he just obeyed, tucking into a ball and rolling sharply to his left. An arrow whizzed through the air with a high-pitched whine, striking the shield underneath Dak with a solid thwunk. 2 inches to the left, and it would have speared his shoulder. That's all it took to get Dak to his feet and sprinting back toward the Viking camp. Facing Gorm seemed like the better option at the moment. As he ran, he cut from right to left to make himself a more difficult target. He just crested a low hill when he saw a line of Vikings, hundreds of them, racing for the battlefield, their shields held over their heads to protect themselves from the rain of stones and arrows. It was pretty clear, pretty fast, that Dak would be trampled to death if he kept going. He had no option but to pivot on his heel and run along with them, letting himself get caught up in their roaring energy. Tucked among the massive bodies and huge round shields, Dak felt nearly safe. It was almost as if he were one of them. As they approached the tower, the sound of stones hitting shields became as deafening as the screaming around him. A reed-thin boy holding a tall pole with a pennant streaming from the top grinned at Dak as they ran alongside each other. Dak had just started to smile back when the boy's eyes went wide and his teeth turned a pinkish red. When he fell to his knees, Dak saw a thick spear protruding from between his shoulder blades. Horrified, Dak took a step forward. His instinct was to offer help, even though he knew there was nothing he could do. The boy said nothing, just held out the pole, shoving it into Dak's hands before collapsing. Dak stood there, his hands gripping the pole, no idea what to do next. One of the other Vikings must have seen the look of terror and confusion on Dak's face, because he slapped his back in what was probably meant to be a reassuring gesture, but ended up sending a jolt of pain through him.
"You're the standard bearer now, boy."
He gestured up at the flag.
"That's Siegfried's seal there. Upon your life, you cannot let it fall. Best watch yourself. Holding it makes you a target. The Franks would do anything to get that flag as proof of victory."
And then the man was off, and Dak was left in the middle of battle, staring up at the scrap of cloth hanging limply from the top of the pole. A sluggish bit of breeze found its way to him, lifting the flag so that he could see the banner clearly. If his heart wasn't already frozen in fear, it would have sprouted icicles. He recognized the symbol Siegfried used for his standard. He'd seen it before, on the lapels of Tilda the Lady in Red, etched into the belt buckles of the Amancio brothers, and scraped into a wall in 1792 Paris. It was the symbol of the SQ, and it was apparently now Dak's responsibility to protect it. "What in the name of mincemeat is Dak thinking?" Sera groaned. She and Bill knelt side by side, staring out the murder hole to where Dak stood, holding a flag that lifted in the meager breeze. "He's just made himself a target!" Beside her, Bill tensed and cursed under his breath, using a word the device in her ear refused to translate. "What is it?" she asked, dread already pooling in her stomach. "I recognize the emblem on that standard," he said. "It's the symbol of the men who attacked Lindisfarne." Sera frowned. "The symbol of the SQ. That's why we're here. Siegfried is SQ, and we have to stop him from amassing power." Bill pressed his face against the hole again and spoke as she did the same. "It's not just that one banner I'm worried about. It's all the others." Sera let her eyes roam across the battlefield. Now that she was looking for something other than Dak, she realized that half the men bore some form of the SQ symbol. It was carved into helmets, painted on the hulls of ships, even woven into the cloaks thrown over Viking shoulders. "They're everywhere," she said in shock. Bill turned until he was facing her, and she could feel the warm puffs of his breath against her cheek. "Is there any way they could know that you're here?" She shook her head. "No, not unless—" She caught herself just as she was about to mention Dak. She knew he wouldn't have said anything to give the three of them away. Then she remembered the Viking who'd accompanied Siegfried to the cathedral, the one with the scar across his face. There was one of Siegfried's men that seemed like he might have been suspicious. Why? Bill leaned back against the wall, his hands worrying along the edge of his dagger. "You represent a threat to the power it's taken the SQ 11 centuries to amass. If they even suspect there's someone from the future behind these walls, they'll stop at nothing to get to you." Sera looked back at the battlefield. There were soldiers for as far as she could see. Individually, they were like drops of water that combined to create a massive ocean. "How can we hope to fight so many?" Bill hesitated before answering, which, Sera was coming to realize, was never a good sign. "I think you have to face the possibility that Paris might fall," he said at last. "And if that happens, you have no choice but to warp out of here and keep the Infinity Ring from falling into SQ control." Chapter 10. Taking a Dive. Dak spent most of the next few hours trying to avoid getting killed, which wasn't as easy as it sounded. Even though the Franks were wildly outnumbered, they had the benefit of thick walls between them and the Vikings. Plus, they were fighting to defend their homes, which made them especially formidable. To make his task of staying alive, and in one piece, even more difficult, Dak wore no armor and carried no weapons. He just had the stupid flag, which meant he couldn't sneak away either. Every time he tried to hand it off to someone else, he was met with hearty slaps on the back and congratulations for making it as long as he had. Apparently, standard bearer was a very short-term gig with a high mortality rate. The only benefit to his position was that he had plenty of time to race around the fortifications, searching for a way inside. He knew that trying to use force would be useless. If 30,000 Vikings couldn't break down the wall, what hope did an 11-year-old boy have? His only chance would be to use his brain, which was overflowing with tales of fortresses being taken in various ways. His favorite had always been the story of Chateau Gaillard, a supposedly impenetrable medieval castle. Among its many features was an extra bathroom built in the chapel. Following the orders of King John of England, a little room had been constructed so that it hung off the side of the building, with a hole in the floor. It's what passed for luxury in those days. When the French king, Philippe II, attacked Chateau Gaillard, the people inside felt pretty secure about being able to wait out the siege. But then came a soldier named Ralph the Snubnose, who noticed a stain under a hole off to the side of one of the walls and, using the nose for which he was named, figured out what the hole was used for. That unlucky soldier had to climb his way up the toilet chute and through the hole to get into the castle. Ew. It worked. The guy surprised everyone inside and opened the gate to let his army in. If that's what it took for Dak to find a way back to Sera and Rick, he was willing to try it. which is how he found himself staring up at the top of the tower when the men inside rolled a massive stone grinding wheel until it tottered just on the edge. One tiny tap, and the thing would come crashing down. Dak stood next to a group of Vikings wielding pickaxes against the base of the wall. They were so focused on their task that they had no idea of the danger looming above. Dak didn't even pause to think about the fact that some of these Vikings were with the SQ, which technically made them the bad guys. "Move!" he shouted. He swung his pole around to shove two of the men back, and then dove at a third, tackling him to the ground and rolling. The stone wheel seemed to fall in slow motion, like a clip from an action movie. Dak could have sworn he felt the compression of air around him as a circular shadow grew larger until it seemed to swallow him. He was pretty sure he was about to be squashed like a bug. At the last minute, he tucked his knees to his chin just as the wheel slammed into the ground, barely missing his toes. The impact caused his teeth to jar and his whole body to lift into the air. Men cried out in anguish. One of them had both of his legs pinned, and Dak thought he might have seen a hand sticking out from underneath, the hand of someone who'd been crushed and killed. Around him, Vikings leapt into action, striving to pull the injured men free as smaller stones and arrows fell around them. Dak tried to control his breathing, tried not to vomit all over himself as he dug into the mud to help. He felt his chin wobble and his throat burn with the promise of tears. With great effort, he swallowed them back. He glanced up at the tower, where Frankish soldiers leaned out over the edge, taunting the injured and dead below. Suddenly, the lines that seemed so clear when they'd warped here became fuzzy. He knew that many of the Vikings must be SQ and therefore his enemy. At the same time, he'd spent the afternoon with these men, listening to their shouts as they worked together and fought together, sometimes even trading jokes. They had protected him with their shields and accepted him as their bannerman. They couldn't all be evil, could they? And even if they were, did they deserve to die like this? Dak was still trying to sort it all out when he saw what looked like a curl of smoke rising up from the top of the tower. Rick appeared then, leaning over and shouting something down at Dak, but there was too much noise for him to catch what the older boy was saying. What on earth was he doing up there to begin with? Rick began to wave his arms frantically, but it wasn't until Dak saw the lip of a steaming cauldron that he understood what he was trying to say. Rick was warning Dak, telling him to get out of the way. Already, drops of the burning, viscous liquid were falling like rain, hitting the ground around him with popping and hissing sounds. Dak looked at the Viking soldiers grouped around the injured men, their shields held over their heads to keep their fallen comrades safe. They had no idea what was coming. He wanted to save them, but it was already too late. Rick's expression was bleak when he stumbled upon Sera and Bill. As soon as she laid eyes on him, Sera's stomach tightened into frightened knots. "What's wrong?" Rick said only one word, his voice almost a whisper. "Dak." She leapt to her feet, ignoring the way her hands were beginning to tremble. He's okay, she thought. He just had to be. But the longer Rick avoided her eyes, the more she began to fear the rest. Bill stood and moved next to her, his arm just barely brushing her shoulder. His hand slipped into hers and she squeezed, not realizing until that moment what it meant to have someone by her side for whatever Rick was about to say next. "What happened?" she whispered. Rick shook his head. It was chaos. He drew in a deep breath as if to steel himself to say the words aloud. Dak was with a band of Vikings trying to dig under the tower. He swallowed a few times. The Franks dropped cauldrons of hot pitch and wax down on top of them. Sera felt like the floor was dropping away from her. The sensation was similar to the after effect of a remnant. Nausea, dizziness, and a confusion about time and space. Rick wiped a hand across his face. "I didn't realize it was happening until it was too late, or I would have stopped it." "Did you see his?" No matter how hard Sera struggled, she couldn't bring herself to say the word body. But it was clear Rick knew what she was asking.
Some of them jumped into the river.
A ribbon of hope began to thread its way through Sera. So he could have escaped. He could still be alive. Rick hesitated before answering, and the pause buoyed her sense of optimism for a moment before it all came crashing down. Sera, the ones who dove into the Seine were on fire. That's why they were so desperate for water. His voice broke as he added, I saw Dak's body floating down the river. He was face down, and he wasn't moving. Chapter 11. The Dead Man's Float. Dak fought his way to the surface of the river, his lungs burning. He'd only recently been tossed overboard from the Santa Maria, and he hadn't survived that to end up drowning now. Finally, his head broke free, and he felt fresh air on his cheeks. His first breath was a choking wheeze that sputtered into coughing. Around him, the battle still raged, though the tenor of it had changed. Small flames peppered the ground at the base of the tower, but most of the Vikings who had just been fighting there were gone. Dak couldn't bear looking at any of the nearby bodies. It was too much, too real that the men he'd been working alongside were now dead. His stomach twisted, and he gagged on a mouthful of vile river water. It didn't take Dak long to realize he was a target while treading water in the middle of the river, but his options were severely limited. The wall prevented him from climbing to land on the island side, and men who staggered ashore on the mainland were quickly brought down by arrows and bolts. Those seemed to be the lucky ones. Other Vikings fought to pull off their heavy armor, even as it dragged them down into the depths of the water. Throughout all of this, the Franks taunted their enemy, shouting, "Right badly burned, aren't you? Go jump in the river to save your flowing manes!" Dak was really beginning to hate those guys, and not just because they were trying to kill him, which gave him an idea. If they wanted him dead, so be it. He slumped in the water, letting his body go limp. His back bobbed along the surface as his legs dragged below. The current tugged at him, pulling him away from the tower and the bridge to safety. Every now and again, he lifted his head, just barely, to take in a lungful of air. When they taught him the dead man's float at the pool for P.E., he thought it was useless, even though it was the only thing he was really good at in that class, and he hadn't resisted letting his teacher know how he felt. As Dak floated to safety, he made a mental note to find Mr. Foltz and thank him when he got back to his own time. Something cold nudged Dak's hand. He'd been washed ashore ages ago, and even though he was drenched with foul river water and freezing, he wasn't taking any chances. That's why he'd spent the last several hours playing dead and didn't plan on moving until dark. But curiosity got the best of him now. He cracked open an eye and came face to face with rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. Dak had never been a really great actor, and he completely broke character now. No one was going to believe he was dead once he yelped and started to scrabble backward. He didn't get far before a very wet and very smelly tongue lapped his face from chin to hair. He recognized the stench immediately. "Ew, Viggy," he grumbled as he wiped the drool from his cheeks. "We need to find you a toothbrush." In response, the dog nudged him, her nose prodding at his hand until he relented and tangled his fingers in her ears. She sat with a thud and then slipped to the ground, rolling against him with her 4 paws in the air.
"I think she likes you," a voice barreled. "Though you'd be the first."
Dak raised his eyes to find Rollo towering above him. He carried a huge sword in his meaty fist, and Dak couldn't stop staring at it. The double-edged blade was probably almost as long as he was tall. It was just his luck that he'd avoided being crushed, pierced, burned, and drowned, only to die under a giant's sword just when he thought things were beginning to look up. At least the blade appeared sharp, so his death would be quick. Rollo must have sensed the direction of Dak's thoughts, because he glanced at his sword and started to laugh, a sound like thunder.
"Sorry,"
he said, slipping the weapon into a leather scabbard hanging on his left hip.
I didn't mean to let Kettlinger scare you.
Except that when the device in Dak's ear translated Kettlinger, Dak couldn't hold back the snort of laughter. Wait, you named your sword Kitten? As in meow? Rollo scowled, which was a pretty terrifying sight that caused Dak to choke on his giggles.
If you've ever been on the wrong end of a ticked-off kitten, you know how ferocious they can be.
Dak fell into a spasm of coughing to hide his amusement, which only caused Rollo to slam his palm against Dak's back as if to help, truly knocking the wind out of him. While Dak struggled for air, the Viking hauled him to his feet.
"Let's head back to camp,"
he said, gesturing down the river in the direction of light on the horizon.
"Fighting's over for the day, and it's time for dinner. I'd already be eating if it weren't for Vicky and her whining. She wouldn't shut up until I agreed to let her look for you."
The dog in question sat next to Dak, mouth open in a grin as she panted happily away. He tweaked her ears, and she leaned against him, almost knocking him over. "I really need to, He glanced up at the side of a nearby ship, desperate for an excuse. He knew that so long as anyone was watching him, there was no way for him to recover the square and sneak back into the fortified city. "I should really check to make sure none of the shields have splinters. You know how that can be out on the battlefield. Nothing worse, really." This elicited a hearty laugh.
"Nonsense," Rollo boomed. "You've distinguished yourself today, held the standard high, and saved many lives. Men back at camp want to honor you and share food." He then frowned. "Trust me when I say, these are not men you want to keep waiting."
Dak remembered how ferocious the soldiers had been on the battlefield, and imagining them turning their ire on him was enough to propel him along the riverbank with Rollo. Besides, the thought of real, actual Viking warriors wanting to thank Dak for his bravery, that was an experience he didn't want to miss. Chapter 12. Learning a Secret. Sera tried to avoid looking at the faces of those she passed as she walked with Rick over the bridge and back to the fortified city. The night was dark, which helped, but she still couldn't help noticing the hollowness of everyone's eyes, the slump of their shoulders. Despite all the damage they had done, it was barely a dent in the Viking force. A batch of men was repairing the tower and trying to build onto it, but how long could the city really stand against such an onslaught? As depressing as these thoughts were, it was better than thinking about Dak. Sera knew that Rick was convinced something terrible had happened to her best friend, that he might even be dead. But she refused to believe that. If something truly awful had happened to him, she'd have felt it. It didn't make scientific sense, and she knew it. Sera was usually the first one to dismiss what she called mumbo-jumbo psychic rubbish. Once, in 3rd grade, a girl in class had argued that certain lines on a person's palm revealed how long that person would live, how successful they would be, and even if they would get married. Sera had been the one to explain how such ideas had no scientific basis. Her entire life had been ruled by facts and data rather than emotion. But now, she was relying purely on emotion, on her belief that Dak was still alive somewhere out in the Viking camp, and it frightened her. "Bill told me he suggested we leave Dak and warp away," Rick said, interrupting her thoughts and breaking the silence. Bill had given them some sort of excuse about finding food and shelter, but really Sera knew he was leaving the two of them alone to figure out what to do next. "Dak has the square," Sera reminded Rick. "Without that, we have no idea what the next break is." Rick stopped and put a hand on her arm. "But if we knew where to go next, would you warp away?" She opened her mouth, but no answer came out. "What if it were me out there instead?" he asked. That answer came to her immediately. She'd probably leave him behind. Though she didn't voice it out loud, her cheeks colored with embarrassment, which gave Rick his answer. He grunted and looked away. I know what the right answer is, he finally said. Fixing the brakes is more important than any one of us, and if I'm ever the one out there, I hope you make the decision to leave me. It's not like I have much of anything to go back to. He crossed his arms over his chest. This surprised Sera. You have your parents. That's more than I have. He lifted a shoulder. Ever wonder how I can speak so many languages? Sure, I'm a prodigy. He flashed the cocky smile she was used to, but it disappeared quickly. But I also have a lot of time on my own. Both my parents are historians. That kind of thing takes over your life if you haven't noticed. She frowned. It doesn't have to. In response, Rick laughed. Says the girl more than a millennium away from home. Just when Sera thought she was getting to see a new side of Rick, one that wasn't cocky and bristly, he had to go and mess it up. Sera was tired of it. Why do you always have to be such a pill? She asked. Rick seemed genuinely surprised by the question, which spurred her on. You're always arguing, bickering more like it. Why can't you just get along with people? He opened his mouth to answer, and then closed it before turning away. Sera watched how his shoulders tensed. You experience remnants, right? He asked. Sera was caught off guard. He knew the answer already, but it still seemed so personal. She usually only talked about the subject with Dak, even though he didn't really understand what it was like. Sera nodded. The events of the past several days caught up to her all at once, and she allowed herself to slide down a wooden fence until she was sitting on hard-packed dirt. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around her legs. They used to be rare, she explained. Sometimes I'd go to this old barn that stood on the edge of my uncle's property, and I'd just know that at any minute the door would be flung open and two people would come strolling out toward me. It felt like they... She cut herself off, feeling embarrassed. She pressed her finger against the dirt, dragging it in the endless loops of the infinity sign. Rick sat next to her, close enough that she could feel a bit of warmth from him. They were what? He prodded. She shifted and shrugged, feeling uncomfortable sharing something so personal. It just felt like I should know them, she said softly. That they love me more than anything else in the world? There. She'd said it. The one secret that she'd never even shared with Dak. He had two parents who adored him and supported him, whereas she'd never known her parents. It was an absence her life always tilted around. Rick didn't tell her she was stupid. He simply accepted everything she said as if he understood. Your remnants. They've been getting worse, haven't they? He asked. Sera sighed. It started when we were on the Santa Maria and I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror. And now I get remnants sometimes when I just say something, usually when I'm bossing Dak around. She tried to laugh a bit to ease the seriousness of their discussion. Rick smiled, but it was half-hearted. He seemed distracted. She decided to ask him the question that had been on her mind for days. When we were on the Santa Maria, you mentioned that if we fixed the brakes, we wouldn't have to deal with remnants anymore. You said that we were saving the world, but we were also saving ourselves. Sera took a deep breath. So, do you have them too? Remnants? He nodded slowly, and she waited for him to say more. Is it okay if... He cleared his throat and shifted as if uncomfortable. If I don't talk about it? Sera tried not to feel hurt and disappointed, but it must have showed in her expression because he leaned toward her until his shoulder bumped hers and added, Yet? I'm just not ready to talk about it yet. She bumped him back. If Rick wasn't ready yet, then she'd wait. But here's the thing that really scares me, he said. Mine have been getting worse. Much, much worse. I can't go more than a few hours without experiencing one. I'm worried that something we're doing here is causing it to happen, that we made a huge mistake. He turned, finally looking her in the eye. What if we've made the effects of the break worse rather than better? Chapter 13. A Sinking Feeling. Dak wasn't sure how much more he could take. He'd planned to start the day extra early by slipping away from camp while it was still dark, grabbing the square, and finding a way back to Sera and Rick. Things hadn't worked out that way. Apparently, what Dak considered extra early, the Vikings considered past time to get the day started. He was roused by the clamor of chainmail and armor and the general hustle and bustle of men preparing for battle. He tried to sneak away, but only succeeded in joining with a band of soldiers headed toward the Seine. At first, he had his hopes up that they'd use the boats to attack the bridge and tower, and it would be easy for him to recover the square. But of course, Dak was never that lucky. Instead, he found himself stuck nearly all day with the job of gathering debris from the battlefield, broken siege engines, trampled plants, even the bodies of executed prisoners. Anything and everything he could carry. All because someone had come up with the brilliant idea of filling in the shallows of the river so that the Vikings' infantry could get around the tower. It was the most horrific job Dak could ever imagine, much, much worse than scrubbing the deck of the Santa Maria or sneaking around in the Parisian sewers during the French Revolution. And he was miserable. Time and time again, he looked for an opportunity to sneak away, but nothing ever presented itself. Until he overheard a few men discussing their next brilliant plan, lighting a few ships on fire and guiding them down the river toward the bridge. And one of the ships they planned to use was the very one on which he'd hidden the square. Dak's heart sped up. The square was their only lifeline to their own time period. If they lost the square, they might as well give up on fixing any other breaks. They might as well give up on looking for his parents. "I'll help," Dak volunteered, almost tripping over his own feet as he raced to catch up with the group of soldiers making their way to the ships. He waited for them to brush him off, but then he realized that two of them were men he'd saved the day before. They didn't turn him away, but instead welcomed him with hearty slaps on his back. Dak was surprised by how good it felt to be accepted into something so easily. He'd always been more of an outcast at school, made fun of for his habit of spouting random bits of history. That's one reason he and Sera were such good friends. Being outcasts gave them something in common. He'd have never guessed that he'd ever feel at home with a band of Viking warriors. As they made their way to the ships, gathering dried grasses and sticks, Dak watched his companions. Many of them weren't much older than Rick, but they had a look in their eyes that said they'd lived very different lives. For them, there was no such thing as school or hanging out at museums or going to lectures given by world-renowned physicists. But the Vikings' lives also weren't only about war, as Dak had once thought. Most of these men were simply looking for a place to settle, land to work, and women to marry. But because most of the Viking history was oral rather than written, so much information about them was lost over time. What written details did survive tended to be recorded by those who lost battles against the Northmen, which made it easy to see why the portrayals were mostly negative. Sure, some of the Vikings were bloodthirsty, only interested in pillaging and killing, but that wasn't the majority. Dak marveled at how he'd almost described some of these men as friends, which was why it was that much more difficult to share their food and camp, and yet also try to figure out ways to thwart their efforts at getting into the city. The longer the Vikings were kept at bay, the better chance the historians had of keeping Siegfried from amassing power and of fixing the break, which meant Dak had to sabotage the very people who'd accepted him as one of their own. They split into several groups and spread out among the chosen ships to stuff them with the dried debris and prep them to be set on fire. Dak made sure he was assigned to the boat where he'd hidden the square. His heart pounded hard. What if someone else had found it first? What if it had somehow slipped free and was now in the bottom of the river, broken beyond repair? He climbed aboard and checked the shield he'd thought he'd hidden it behind. It wasn't there. Had it been moved? Did he just have the wrong spot? As Dak started to search the boat, someone tossed a flaming torch into the aft hull. The fire sparked instantly, eating along the deck and across benches. Overhead, the sail roared, its fabric catching quickly. Dak was running out of time fast. Heat buffeted him, and sweat broke out across his forehead and neck. Twice he shied away from the crackle of the hungry fire, But he couldn't give up on finding the square. The boat started to make its way down the river away from the group of Vikings and toward the bridge. Dak was stuck on board, still frantically searching behind every shield. There were 25 along each side, and so far he'd only checked out half of them. From the shore, men shouted for him to jump. But he couldn't give up. If the square was destroyed, it wouldn't matter that Dak survived the fire. They'd never be able to fix the great breaks and avoid the cataclysm. Wind whipped around him, feeding the flames and sending smoke spiraling into the sky. The flaming ships were drawing dangerously close to the bridge. If the Vikings succeeded in catching the bridge on fire, it would collapse, and they'd have free reign up the Seine to the cities and villages beyond. That bridge wasn't just protecting Paris, but also the rest of France and the future of Europe. It was the only thing keeping Siegfried and the rest of the SQ from amassing even more power. Suddenly, Dak's priorities were split. He had to find the square, but he also had to make sure the flaming boat didn't make it to the bridge. Which was more important? With a sinking stomach, he abandoned the search for the square and pulled out an axe he'd found among the battlefield debris. He began swinging it at a seam between two boards of the hull, trying to make an opening. The wood was thick and solid, and Dak despaired of making any headway, but heat from the fire must have already weakened it because a crack began to form. Billowing smoke choked the air around him, making his eyes water and lungs burn. The fire burned fiercely, consuming everything as it made its way toward the bow, where Dak hacked furiously at the hull. The wood groaned in protest, and then a spurt of water sprayed up through a small hole in the bottom of the boat. It only took 3 more whacks with the axe for a healthy amount of water to begin filling the boat, slowing its progress toward the bridge. Dak was almost out of time. The fire had already eaten its way past the mast, destroying more than half of the shields along the way. As fast as possible, Dak checked the rest of the ship for the square. Water dragged at his feet, climbing up his calves. He found the square in the very last place left to be checked. The bag holding it was already drenched, and he pulled the square free and slipped it into the waistband of his pants under his tunic. With a whoop of success, he leapt from the ship, landing knee-deep in the shallows of the river. As he fought his way against the current toward shore, he watched as the ship took on more water and began listing to its side before capsizing and sinking just as its bow struck a grouping of rocks used to support the bridge. The other boats fared no better, crashing against the sunken boat just shy of the bridge. It was a beautiful sight to Dak, and he felt a surge of pride at having accomplished both tasks. He'd rescued the square and kept the Vikings from scoring a hit against Paris. All in all, Dak was pretty much a hero as far as he was concerned. Before he could gloat too much, Dak was forcibly spun around. Gorm, the scarred Viking, grabbed him by the tunic, almost lifting him from the ground.
"You think you're clever, don't you?"
His face was so close that spit flew from his mouth with every word, peppering Dak's cheeks. He scrambled for some sort of excuse and came up empty. "I don't know what you're talking about." The Viking wrenched the axe from Dak's grip and tossed it into the river. Dak started to protest, but thought better of it. Dak was caught. He struggled to get free of the man's grasp, but it was useless. Without a weapon, he had no hope against someone so much stronger and larger. The Viking grinned in an unpleasant way, the scar across his face causing his features to twist.
"I know someone who will be very interested in speaking with you."
Chapter 14. A Call from the Future. It started raining when the sun set, and Sera was drenched. Her teeth chattered as she huddled under the shelter of an old empty barn. "At least the weather put an end to most of the fighting," Bill suggested, trying to find something to be cheerful about. Sera only grunted in return. She couldn't stop thinking of her warm bed in her warm house in a time when such a thing as gas heat existed. "I'd kill for a hot shower right now," she grumbled. "A jacuzzi would be even better," Rick agreed. Bill looked between them, confused. "What's a shower?" Sera glanced his way, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest to keep as much warmth pressed to her body as possible. It had hardly occurred to her before meeting the historians that there would be a period in time when something as basic as a shower didn't exist. It's like a bath, but the hot water falls from a shower head, from a contraption in the wall or ceiling, like a waterfall, she explained. Bill still looked confused. That sounds like a lot of work for your servants to heat that much water. How many buckets does he take? Sera opened her mouth and then closed it, looking to Rick for help. The water's already hot, and you don't need buckets, Rick said. Most houses in our time have a heater inside, so there's always hot water when you turn on the tap. Oh. It was clear Bill didn't really follow, but he was trying. What else is there in the future? Sera closed her eyes, not even knowing where to begin. Her world was just so different from Bill's on every conceivable level. But there was one other thing she wished she had, even more than a hot shower. A phone to call Dak on to see if he was okay. She tried to explain that to Bill. Well, for one thing, we have these things called cell phones. It's a way for you to talk to someone else who might be far away. Bill's eyes grew wide. How does that work? When she was 6, Sera had built her own encrypted smartphone so that she and Dak could talk whenever they wanted. She started explaining the basics of the advanced mobile phone system and digitized sampling, but Rick interrupted her. Ignore techno-geek over there. Basically, everyone has a phone number, a series of numbers, that you plug into a keypad and, ta-da, you're talking to that person. I'm more of a language guy than a numbers guy, though, and since the numbers have letters associated with them, that's how I memorize them. My phone number, for example, just happens to spell out the first 10 letters of sesquipedalianist. He paused before adding, It means I like big words. Bill's brow was furrowed, and he looked like he was just about to ask a question when Sera bolted to her feet. That's it, she said excitedly. She pressed her palms against her forehead and groaned. I can't believe I didn't see it before. For the love of mincemeat, it was so simple. Rick and Bill exchanged glances. Sera? Rick asked. What are you talking about? She knelt, using her finger to draw out a series of numbers in the dirt. It didn't take long for Rick to figure out what she was doing. When she hesitated, trying to remember what came next, he helped to fill in the gaps. It's the series of numbers from the square, she said. We thought it was some sort of bifid cipher, but we couldn't figure out what the key was. She began to draw vertical lines to separate the numbers into pairs. Below that, she sketched the face of a phone keypad, and that's when Rick groaned. Oh, I get it now. The first number indicates which number on the keypad, and the second is the letter's position. So since A, B, and C are all on the number 2 button, 21 becomes the letter A. How did we miss that before? Sera was so elated that she couldn't help laughing at the look of utter confusion on Bill's face. Brent and Mari wanted to ensure that no one from the past could figure out the key to the cipher. What better way to do that than use a gadget only someone from our time period would know? Rick was already matching letters to each pair of numbers so that 32 became E and 62 became N. As he worked, Bill reached over and ran the knuckles of his hand along the edge of Sera's jaw. Her breath caught, and her cheeks blazed with heat. You'd smudged some dirt, he said softly. She didn't know what to say and settled with, oh, which elicited a smile from him. That only made her neck burn hot as well, and she wondered if Bill could see how furiously she was blushing in the dim light. She hoped not. For his part, Rick seemed oblivious, his forehead scrunched up in concentration as he unraveled the message. 32627482 7332 7443324133 73433231 8121 5232 74 7121 7343 74 7132 21 23 32 33 82 53 53 93. Ensure Siegfried takes Paris peacefully. All the blood heating Sera's cheeks drained as the message swirled through her mind. If that's true... She couldn't even finish the statement. She didn't want to give it voice, as if that could somehow make it real. Rick didn't have such hesitation. He looked at her, his own face betraying fear. Then we've definitely made things worse. Dak was beginning to realize just how much trouble he'd gotten himself into. His arms were pinned behind him by the scarred Viking named Gorm, who looked a little too pleased to finally have Dak in his clutches. Even though he had a good idea where he was being taken, his stomach twisted into knots as they approached the large structure dominating the far end of the camp. While most other Vikings slept out in the open or under simple A-frame tents, apparently Siegfried would do with nothing less than a wooden-framed hut. Gorm thumped Dak forcefully on the back, shoving him so hard that he stumbled into the hovel. All conversation inside halted, though a few men snickered when Dak tripped and fell to his hands and knees. Dak grimaced as the dirt floor scraped his palms. He felt the square shift where it was jammed against his back, and he froze, hoping it wouldn't slide free. If Siegfried or any of the other men saw the square, that would be the end of Dak, and maybe even Sera and Rick as well. He couldn't risk it. Slowly and carefully, he lifted his head and looked around, using the movement to mask how he twisted his body to try and keep the square in place. The structure had been built rapidly, and it showed in the crooked windows and uneven slant of the doorframe. In the center blazed a fire, its smoke creating a thick layer of sludge along the ceiling as it struggled to find a way free through a hole in the roof. Carved earthen platforms topped with wooden boards and dingy rugs were built against the walls. But what really drew Dak's attention were the men crouched around the fire, the flickering light casting shadows under their eyes. In the center of them sat Siegfried on the only stool in the room. Behind his shoulder, a massive wooden shield hung from the wall, the SQ symbol emblazoned on it. He looked over Dak's head to where Gorm, the Time Warden, stood in the door. "This doesn't look like dinner," he said, raising one eyebrow. It didn't escape Dak's notice that this was the second time in 2 days someone had discussed eating him. He was really beginning to hate the 9th century.